So, is there a good estimate about the magnitude of the effect on performance of mood disturbance from getting disturbed mood to overtraining syndrome? And then maybe more importantly, is there evidence that when you intervene, that there's a performance benefit?
The part two, no, because there have been so few intervention studies. And one of the problems is that the criteria for performance differs from sport to sport. And typically when they're training this hard, their level of performance is dropped anyway. Romain Musin has this double performance thing where he has them do all-out workouts, like Wingate workouts, twice a day to test this. But that's really invasive to get athletes to even do this. So one of the problems is that the coaches and athletes are very reluctant to let you get your hands on them to really try to even measure this. So what you brought up is really a fundamental weakness in this area. We have many different criteria for performance which are not equivalent across sports. And then you have athletes who aren't performing well anyway, and then they don't even want to do tests for you. So the estimate is, and this is an estimate, is that if you expect to see 15 to 20% drops with overtraining syndrome. But to be honest, I've seen athletes that literally cannot play ping pong for 15 minutes. It's almost like chronic fatigue syndrome. Those are the most unusual cases. So this is a perennial weakness here. Absolutely.
I had a question about the ISOP
Uh-huh.
and whether it is actually specific to athletic performance and whether it can be applied more generally to other types of performance.
That's an interesting question. Dr. Henning himself has actually used this in the business world, and he feels that it's very applicable to other domains of performance. And to me, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I actually gave a talk on that to some surgeons in Norway, and they all kind of lit up. They sort of understood that. So when you describe this to people who do different things, it seems to make sense to them. I will say that his model is extended beyond anxiety. He talks about positive and negative emotions in a broader context. So there are other emotions that are sort of blended or co-occur with anxiety, which I also think makes sense. So I'd say, yeah, the answer to that I feel is yes.
So this is kind of specific, but in the consensus statement, the continuum for overreaching versus overtraining is not super specific.
No, it's not.
So I'm wondering if you would be willing to suggest a cutoff for example, total mood disturbance for identifying well-trained versus in danger zone versus already crossed that threshold.
Well, you bring up two good points. One, important, but is there is no good cutoff between overreaching and overtraining syndrome. And unfortunately, there's the idea that there's functional and non-functional and that's not been borne out very well in research. So that distinction, I think, makes sense conceptually. You want to push them enough, that's functional, and then if it's a little too far. But when you start trying to actually identify what's happening, you can't tell it apart. In terms of the level of mood disturbance, the challenge there is that the one example I showed you was based on like a team criterion, and then you base it on the team. Other people have used athletes' their own baselines and so it's like an intra-individual. So the few studies that have done this have each measured it in different ways, and some have used a 1 standard deviation cutoff. We used a half standard deviation. So what you're asking here is something that badly needs to be done.
Actually, we tried it and we used 10 as a general. If you change from baseline to peak greater than 10 points, maybe you started the continuum. And it didn't seem super helpful, but it also wasn't a real intervention.
So the athletes who are healthy tend to have rather small elevations,
Right.
And when you look at the average, it looks like, oh, there's a lot, but it's these athletes who are going up to 220 and 180. So yes, we don't have those sorts of tools. We don't have that measuring stick yet. We need it. Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the data that you presented seemed to be on sports that had a few, they were endurance sports where individual performance is really important and you have a very good measure of individual performance. Do you see the same thing in more team sports where you don't have those individual performances as much?
Yes, I think for overtraining syndrome. Yes, if the training is sufficient. So we've done this with volleyball and found dose-response relationships, and basketball. We did actually the IU basketball team Coach Knight was the coach, but we didn't tell him we did the study. I didn't tell him. I was the assistant coach. Yeah, I was afraid. I didn't want to tell him. And he's not a co-author on that. One of the things we learned, for instance, with volleyball is we'd see these other things happening at the same time. So there were these other sources of stress that were impinging. So there were interpersonal issues. The freshman athletes had gigantic disturbances the first week or two. And so that's one thing that this mood state measure doesn't do. It doesn't distinguish between what sorts of stressors are causing these changes. Now, you can look at that in two ways. One, you could say that muddies up the waters because you don't know whether the mood disturbance is training related or not. But there are certain theories of overtraining syndrome that say it doesn't matter. It's the totality of all the stresses, whether they're from training or interpersonal or social issues, and that the compounded stress can result in contributes to overtraining syndrome. So, I think that makes sense conceptually, but people haven't looked at that empirically. But I would say that in those sorts of sports that you're describing, if the training is sufficient, we do see these sorts of elevations. The challenge is that these team sports sometimes have dynamics going on with the players that also can influence their own mood state. So yeah, that's why I don't study volleyball.
A lot of the work was done in the northern Midwest and a lot of the work in Scandinavia. Is there any influence of just general seasonal affective on the mood, just the mood part? Or would that sort of wash out in the population?
You know what, I think that the population, that's a very good question. I don't know. I would expect for some athletes you would definitely see that. But one thing I will say doesn't seem to influence is academic stressors. So there's an early study done here where we looked at non-athletes at the same points of time. So we thought that maybe there were academic stressors that were also contributing. And we saw no changes in the non-athletes, even during finals week.
Well, then they're in the same season, so maybe that would wash out.
And the other thing about swimmers is swimmers, by the time they're in college, are pretty good managers of their time. So, they're generally pretty organized that way. But yes, there definitely could be a seasonal sort of factor as well.
Are there any emerging biological variables that are
Some people think, in terms of heart rate, that you look at sympathetic versus parasympathetic, but I don't know. I mean, heart rate variability, you have some athletes whose heart rates go down, some athletes whose go up, and some who don't change. There was a study done with, I forget what type of Norwegian athlete, where they identified different cardiovascular patterns, but they had 5 patterns. So these 5 patterns, you only had 12 athletes. So I think it just reflected all this sort of variability. What we think conceptually is what's happening is that these mood state responses are almost a summation of all these biological changes. And they simply, fell to the general level. So the inputs might vary from athlete to athlete. I mean, I'm still interested in, we've looked at neuromuscular factors, we've looked at hormonal factors, so I'm still interested in exploring that.
Well, chronic fatigue syndrome, they're in a similar boat. There's not a single system that seems to explain what's going on. So they've moved to examining how these systems interact. So there's the autonomic nervous system communicating with the immune systems, communicating with the brain. And if we understand how these systems are speaking to one another, we better understand.
Yeah, and I think there could be more
Pathophysiology.
multiplicity of systems and different interactions going on. There is one subset of overtrained athletes who are very much like chronic fatigue syndrome. It's like once they get it, they never recover. It appears. It becomes a chronic condition. It's very rare. Why that occurs, no one has any idea. Fortunately, it's rare.
Any other questions?
Still some treats out there.
I hope so. Well, what I'd like to do is I would like to thank Dr. Raglin for an excellent presentation. And because he's a Badger at heart, we're going to give him one of these mugs in appreciation so he can take Bucky back to Ellie.
All right.
Yeah.